Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank. Jason, welcome to the show. It's happy to have you here. Master of rods and strings. You have the background for it, so I might as well hit that topic right off in the beginning. Jason, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Robbie. Jason Harris, as you said there. I often include the Marc in the middle just because there are other Jason Harrises. Back one time, it's back in high school, I tried calling home. I misdialed one digit, and I reached another Jason Harris. And we both ended up having a very surreal experience because of that. It was really odd.
That's how I get when someone has my name. Like if it's Robbie Robertson, that never happens. So it's usually get linked to the guitar player or something. But whenever I come across a Robbie or a person with the same last name as me, I go, we're automatically family. Like at that point.
Right. No, that's neat. I even added like one other Jason Marc Harris on social media just because he existed, So.
Please tell me a little bit about yourself, and also anything, if you want to bring anything up, the book, for instance, like I said before, Master of Rods and Strings.
Sure. So I teach at Texas A&M University, teach creative writing and some folklore and literature. I've been teaching about 20 years. This book is pretty new. It came out in July just this year. It's published by Vernacular Books, which has a number of sci-fi, fantasy, horror titles. And it basically deals with a character in France in a town that's focused on the art of puppetry. And he grows up with this as an ambition he wants, but his sister is the one who's favored by the uncle who runs this school. And so he jealously and ambitiously pursues trying to become a master puppeteer, and discovers along the way that there's a whole sort of strange sort of society and system of magic and occultism. And he becomes determined to master that as well for vengeance and power. So he's kind of changed by the experience of pursuing the art of puppetry, and learns this a whole other level, so what's behind the scenes, behind people, behind how puppets actually started and what they mean. So that's the gist of it.
How did you typically come up with that idea for something like that? Because immediately, like I told you off airs, when I heard that, I thought it was going to be like government, political type stuff with the inner workings. It seems to be a hot topic in everybody's mind, is kind of more exposure from social media, really checking through all these articles that get published out there. But man, a puppet connection to like the occultism, I mean, that's a fun topic in its own. I mean, it's a lesser version if you want to link it into like the Illuminati type stuff, but it's interesting because everyone feels like for me, I have thoughts of like how many of my thoughts are my own thoughts. Like when I'm sitting here through all my guests, I've had to consume some of that experience or some of those thoughts that people have kind of either popped in a question or some type of thing into my head where I've gained some information. But then there's times I'm like 2 o'clock in the morning staring up at my ceiling. I'm like, why does everyone have that popcorn ceiling? It doesn't make sense. That's my own thought. But then there's other thoughts out there.
Where do they come from? Mm-hmm. Definitely the question of who's pulling the strings. I would say one influence. Are you familiar with the horror writer Thomas Ligotti? He's well worth looking up. And in fact, some of his kind of attitudes expressed in his writing about a kind of universal cosmic pessimism, and sort of what you're talking about, that sort of discomfort with lack of free will, informed some of the story in True Detective, the first season, the Matt McConaughey character. In fact, it's been discussed. You can check this out online. Some Ligottian influence there. He had one short story, in particular, called The Clown Puppet, where there's a character who discovers this visitor to his, pharmacy, and it's a human-sized clown puppet. And he's always looking for, well, where are the strings controlling this thing? And it gets even creepier from there. So some of that definitely influenced this story. I made up the town where it takes place. It's dedicated to the patron saint of puppetry, but other locations are all real in France. And I was also sort of exploring the idea of like what more puppets might be in terms of kind of human development, because if you think about it, right? Um, you've seen like images of the angel and the devil on the shoulder, going back to early, Christian morality drama. And, we know that there's some shamanistic practices using masks. And so the story kind of explores in some ways that the early roots of both human consciousness and development may have been connected to some of these other powers, where a puppet itself is not some mere reflection of a human being or comedic imitation, but like a deeper kind of symbiotic relationship, or as you're also saying, something kind of darker, controlling the human puppet. So there's that aspect there too, for sure.
Yeah, my a long time ago in the beginning of my show, I had a buddy of mine who's he's a puppeteer. I would call him probably a master of puppets, maybe not in the style of Jeff Dunham using comedy, but he really kind of explained it best to me, and I want to get your kind of opinion on this. Do you think it's like he's like an inner reflection of the soul, but do you think it's a better way to probably express your feelings in some sense, much like kids when they're young, they have a stuffed animal that they talk to and maybe give a voice like an imaginary friend? I feel like it's like not really a window pane to the soul, but I guess a microphone, as a microphone is to a podcaster getting their voice out there, or some type of way to be able to vocalize maybe internal feelings or some type of maybe balance of thoughts in a way.
No, yeah, that's a great idea. And I know that like some therapy they've used puppets with children, but also, yeah, I mean, I think it's a creative process, right? And it's also something we encounter casually, where someone will say, well, hey, I'm asking for a friend. Like, it's become a joke. Like, no, you're asking for yourself.
Yeah.
So yeah, certainly the image of or the tool of the puppet to in some ways channel what's coming from the self is definitely an interesting yeah, sort of way of engaging the needs of the person psychologically. And yeah, that question of identity, that's also sort of explored here. Like, what's really coming from the main character? To what degree does his puppet actually have a consciousness? And the same way he starts sort of working on his puppet, which he puts together himself, and also changing himself physically as well as mentally, sort of blurs the line there of identity too. Um, yeah. Also, I should say one more influence. You ever read the EC horror comic books? This goes way back, before magazine of the same publisher, EC. Yeah. Well, they would. I know you've heard of Tales from the Crypt. That was adapted to a show. I know Arnold Schwarzenegger directed some of those, and but yeah. So the comic itself, one of them had a character who was a ventriloquist, and you
Crypt
find out.
Keeper.
What's that?
Crypt Keeper.
Yeah, for sure. So this particular story, he has a kind of strange sort of mutant double that kind of came out of his arm. And so he dealt with it by putting on makeup, putting on a little outfit, pretending he was this great ventriloquist. But in fact, it's this second head coming out of his arm that's driving him to basically be a serial killer. But it's actually the little second head who's killing them with the most nasty sharp teeth and so forth. And so a friend of his is sort of investigating what's going on with this guy, and that secret kind of comes out. The idea again that the puppet or the ventriloquist mannequin or dummy could be something other than just a tool, right? But also actually have a kind of consciousness, and also explore what is the difference between these images of people and people themselves. As we go more and more into virtual worlds, AI and robots, we're going to have to kind of come against these questions more and more. And it's interesting to think about, both in a mystical and scientific, psychological way.
I mean, I'd rather take mystical if we're going to talk about like a different form of, like, I guess, I don't know, maybe a mystery horror. I mean, today in society, a lot feels like a horror, but the virtual reality thing is the scariest thing to me. But I feel like my thought is that we're gonna end up warming up to it. It's obviously going to become more normalized. I mean, metaverse, when it first came out, everyone was like, that sounds ridiculous. Nobody wants to live online. Now it's like, man, nobody wants to be out of the group. They're like, might as well get in it while it's like Bitcoin. Everyone trashed it, and then everyone's on board with like, oh, I love it now. It's like the next thing that comes out, everybody's going to want to hop in, if that's the metaverse, if that's whatever. And I mean, It's gonna get interesting because like digital art, digital property, digital like I mean, digital real estate, for instance, buying a square plot of land next to your favorite YouTuber, or you could get one next to Snoop Dogg. I mean, it's strange as hell,
It
which
is for sure.
it,
Yeah.
it,
Hmm.
it makes me like that's why I like talking about that stuff as well too, which I know society's heading to that way. But that just seems like to me like I mean, getting into the occult part again, I think that's like a weird manipulational tactic. I mean, we were talking a little bit off air about the alien thing. MK Ultra, that started resurfacing on the CIA and NPR's website. And I was like, this is weird, man. Like you're releasing undisclosed documents that haven't been released yet on your guys' website, talking about the CIA having tactics for MK Ultra, which was a brain control thing. And it gets me into this territory of like, we know with media marketing, we know with all these things, they have a form of mind control. It's advertising, it's good. But like even the words that you say, if you call someone a truther, like a 9/11 truther, you're automatically like you're implying that you feel like you're 100% right on that, which makes it even harder for people to want to associate with you or talk to you about the topic. And it's like, man, the words that get said, the things that we do, the laws that are passed, where it's like, why is it 25 to rent a car, but it's 18 to smoke cigarettes? Where I'm like, mind explode.
Oh yeah, for sure. All those arbitrary sort of rules. And it's interesting too. You're talking about kind of the power of language, because on the one hand, right, we have certain words that trigger or you get labeled, a whole set of associations, and then in kind of the occult world, you also have the incantatory power of magic, where just saying something is to conjure it or to call it or to call something into being. So it's interesting in some levels how we're still to some degree on kind of a continuum, especially when it comes to language, a type of magical thinking, to call somebody something and therefore they're that, and that's their social reputation that happens. Um, so yeah, the matter of appearances and reality, that's another thing kind of explore.
Well, do you believe more in like the metaphysical aspect of things? Like, do you believe like a lot of people either believe like frequencies, a lot of people like do you believe in the old school style magic thing? Because I think with all the episodes I've had, I'm probably really open minded to all these types of concepts. I mean, there's things that I think like if I think about you and you think about me and I send you a message and then you're like, I was just thinking about you. I
Yeah, for
I
the
don't know what
experience.
that is.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that experience of hearing the phone ring. Well, maybe now you don't hear the ring because you're getting a buzz in your cell phone or something. But yeah, a thing about somebody maybe you haven't heard about from years, and then there they are. Um, yeah, I don't know far what to believe fully. I mean, I do know I've heard interesting some anomalous experiences from some friends, people I've interviewed, partly because of the folklore. So getting kind of belief narratives from people about family legends and ghosts. Um, and even just a couple of things I can think of in my family. My dad and my brother shared a dream when he was like 4 or 5, where my father walked down the hall because he was really stirred by this dream, where they had met on the dark side of the moon, had a little chat. He walks to my brother's room, he's awake, and they talk about it. And it's like, well, that never happened again, but it happened then. So some person had any type of dream, but then, well, what was that? I mean, is there something telepathic that can happen the same way that radios and televisions can send waves out? Maybe there is something. So I stay agnostic as far as, yeah, I stay agnostic in terms of what really might be going on. And that's, would want to have clear evidence. But then there's also the question, if something isn't repeatable, then is it really subject to the scientific method? It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? So there's that interesting sort of gray area there. Yeah, so I don't have a final judgment on whether, for instance, they're ghosts. But I've heard enough stories from people that have to consider the possibility that there is something going on. Let me just mention one case of that. When I used to live in Seattle, went to graduate school there, and someone I collaborated with on a couple books. One is called the Troll Tale and Other Scary Stories. The other is Laugh Without Guilt, a clean joke book. His name is Burke Duncan, and he just helped set up a second edition of that recently. But the first book, one of the things we did was interview people to hear about family legends. And I talked to this one woman who was from Australia, and she talked about being in the basement, going down the stairs with her mother. And they both saw, they were certain, the ghost of their grandmother, but they saw the ghost in different ways. She saw were these arms like reaching out, but she said her mother saw a full figure. There wasn't a camera there, but what does one make of that?
Hmm.
I mean,
What
again, we don't know the truth of anecdotes, but that's something that somebody shared with me, which was quite interesting.
yeah, it gets weird. Because I had a tarot card reader on my show. I had two tarot card readers on my show before, and everyone's like, "Are you really going to get your cards read online?" And I was like, "Yeah, why the hell not? Like, I mean, there's no why I
So
got
the
nothing."
death card doesn't come up, or if it does, interpret it symbolically, right?
Yeah, and it
Or
was like
another
I was like
thing.
I might as well just do it and have fun with it. And they're like, you want to get the death card. That's always the card you want to get. And I'm like, well, that sounds terrible. And they're like, no, it's actually a death to like a bad thing. It's like a death and a birth of a new. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. But it was
Except when it's not, right?
yeah, but they were pulling one of my friends, Gordon, was pulling cards for me, and he's pulling out all these things. Now, everything he said in that whole entire episode has came true so far. There's only a couple things that he predicted later down the line that I haven't came across yet. But it's been eerie. I mean, he's gotten 5 out of like the 10 things right so far that nobody would have ever guessed. And it's interesting, which makes you kind of wonder. And I always have that, like, I always get deja vu all the time. So I always like to think that like there's something, there's got to be something there on that aspect. But if I was going to ask you like a favorite folklore type thing, it doesn't have to be a scary thing, it could be a fun thing. Like I think my favorite myth or folklore type thing, besides like going down the Greek mythology rabbit hole, is the Yeti. I mean, the stories they tell about the Yeti back in like the Tibetan mountains of these giant beasts that if you didn't eat all your vegetables on your dinner plate, or if you didn't go to bed and you tried to move out of your bed, that these giant beasts would hurl rocks at Sherpas off the mountains and then break into your village and take you out of your bed. And they was fond of young women. And it's like these weird, like, this is like a fear mongering thing a parent tells a kid, but at the same time, there's extra stuff that's added in where you're just like, what was the point that this was going for? I don't know. Did it have a sense of realism to it? Possibly.
Right. And we still have people who claim they have some evidence here or there for the Yeti, right? And but is yet to be proven. Um, yeah, as far as a favorite sort of legend or belief, one thing that's interesting. This appears in some literary contexts. The poet William Butler Yates, also another figure in the so-called Celtic Renaissance, the late 19th, early 20th century. Lady Gregory. They both referred. Oh, and also with one more. Uh, Fiona MacLeod was a pen name, but his actual name was William Sharp. It's interesting too. It's an example of a man using a female pen name, and he did this partly because he felt he was connecting with, in a sense, his kind of feminine side, but a side that was sort of the storyteller in him and more mystical. And he's got a character that appears, and all three of them say this is tied to tradition, but I have not been able to find good traditional accounts of it. And that is, there's a belief in the so-called fairy fool, and to see the fairy fool is very dangerous. It can drive you mad. It's an interesting idea, called the Amadon, if I'm remembering correctly, the Amadon. And I found that very intriguing because you hear about the fairy queen, you hear about the trooping fairies, which early beliefs they did not have wings, pre-Shakespeare and so forth. They're often human-sized. But they're also that interesting example of the other when you get into the fairy lore. Carl Sagan in the Demon Haunted World had the theory that alien abductions were
Yeah.
just an updated version. You've heard of this, yeah, of fairy abductions. However, there's still people that believe in fairies, and there's still those who claim to have some encounters. In Iceland, there's something like close to 50% of the population. They've halted construction projects because of areas that they thought were sacred to the fairies based on, a tree, that kind of thing. So hard to be sure, right? It's easy to dismiss and laugh at some of these things, but that particular figure, the fairy fool, is intriguing to me because it's this kind of chaotic, gesture-like figure that it sort of gets in that area of a kind of forbidden knowledge too, because to be driven mad by an encounter with something is horrifying, but it's also kind of intriguing because what sort of knowledge or revelation would it be that would drive a human mind mad. That idea is explored a bit in writings of H.P. Lovecraft, the Necronomicon, right? You read this forbidden tome, and you can't handle it. The Yellow King by Chambers, deals with the second act of this play that drives people mad when you read it. So that's an interesting motif, and for it to appear in folklore to some degree is intriguing to me. Just one more thing about the fairies. There was also the belief that you could suffer the fairy stroke, which could be perhaps an explanation for people who would suddenly actually have a stroke. People tend to think these days, oh, they're these cute little things, but a lot of the earlier lore was rather sinister, rather sinister. There's even accounts of blood drinking types of fairies. So
It's
I'd say the fairy fool is one that's intriguing to me. And if anybody has accounts that they've read somewhere or heard, I'd be curious to hear more about that, because I've been trying to find more actual traditional claims for it.
What do you think led, I guess, to the increase in belief of that? Do you think that was the writing? I guess a lot of writers that talk about these. I mean, if we really like check the scale of past 20 years with the amount of Harry Potter, I would say books and things that have been just increasingly, I guess, read. I mean, even Cthulhu made a giant spark in popularity, I'd say, in like the past 5 years. This more mystical fantasy type thing. I mean, it's not really like the PhD people who study legends or anything that have really been like trying to popularize it more, unless you're writing a book about it. But the writing community that has given like a giant open door platform to incorporate these in their own stories, which causes people to search up these myths and search up this type of folklore, which makes it interesting because it helps explain a lot of my childhood of coming across dream catchers that used to be everywhere. And then like little glass things that they put in their windowsill to be able to like has a fairy on it or something blowing into a moon or something of that sort. It brings a better explanation. And I think a lot of times people don't want to think that just something happens out of nowhere. They like to give a kind of a balance of an effect or some type of causation that happens. And fairies is the best explanation. If someone just randomly has a stroke, you don't want to think they're going to do that all the time. They want to think that's like a rarity from a fairy or some type of spirit. I mean, half the people now who believe in this psychic stuff, they like to take a thing of sage that just smells terrible, just awful, but they're like, it's cleaning bad spirits out of the house. I mean, there's still that belief around here today. And if that gets someone more, I guess, comfortable in the situation that they're in, then yeah, go ahead and do it.
Definitely. It's been claimed with some research behind it that the more sort of chance is involved with an occupation or activity, the more superstitions, or usually the term is folk beliefs, occur. So, for instance, a sport of baseball with averages not being statistically all that high compared to some sports like free throws or something, right? Or fishing, there's a lot of luck involved, a lot of uncertainty. You tend to get a lot of folklore in those situations, which is interesting. See, I was going to say something else on that subject, but why it's sort of being more promoted. It's also great fertile ground, right, for writing. And there's folklore throughout the entire world. There's some stories that they travel internationally, and they'll change a little bit as get different nation. Like the Cinderella story, that's true. For instance, sometimes Cinderella's involved with wearing like a cat skin. Sometimes she solves her problems without recourse to a fairy godmother, for instance. Sometimes it's her own mother, or sometimes it's just her cleverness. But there are other stories that are very particular about a certain place, and there's some landmark that it's tied to. Other times people are convinced, like for instance, there's just a story in this college dorm that's only theirs, and not aware that there's other tales like that circulating by other college dorms, like the secret red room, or the student who, whose roommate died and they got a 4.0, that kind of thing, right? That's one that circulated a lot when I was in college, in fact, about the did that circulate for you? Did you hear that one before?
I think for around the time, I guess the scariest thing I could say that was known as like a myth or a folklore around the time when I was heading into college was probably more on the parts of like, I would say Bloody Mary, or these types of like weird things that you do at a sleepover or something like that, which I mean, I'm still not going to say it into a mirror with the door shut just on a factor. I don't know. I don't believe that I'm going to get killed or anything. It's just an aspect of like, I don't know. It just, It's like saying Beetlejuice 3 times. I don't care if it's a movie or not. I'm still not going to say it 3 times.
Sure. So it's like if you have that infinitesimal chance, there's something to it. You're like, why go down that road or get yourself anxious? I gotta say though, I have a cousin who had the determination to go in a bathroom by himself in the dark, and he did it a bunch of times, and he's just fine. That's one person I know who did get determined to do that. Yeah, those rituals are quite interesting too, as sort of threshold experiences of by the way, also I should mention you when we talk about myth, usually in folklore studies, it refers to a sacred narrative, which often doesn't change so much as opposed to, a ghost story that may change over time in different places. And then the urban legend that's often focused on sort of modern cultures, fears, anxieties, and sometimes hopes, like contaminated food. And we see some that actually is contaminated, like, from time to time. But for a while, things like, putting a baby in a microwave were just urban legends. Unfortunately, it's not just an urban legend anymore.
People start doing it.
Yeah, and that's sort of a horrific thing too. There's sort of an acting out that some people are inspired to do with folklore. The term is ostension for that, and there's different types of that kind of acting out. Slender Man, a very interesting case, right? So starts as a creepypasta online, gets believed by people over time, and then you had
the Slender Man killer.
Yeah, right. You had some mental illness and gravitated towards that, and right. So that's a terrible example in the sense it's horrific.
Another example would be like the Zodiac Killer, for instance. If you watch the film with the Zodiac Killer, where they just apparently found the actual person recently, who actually the actual identity of was it. But if you watch the film, there's a lot of people during the time the Zodiac Killer was like at its height that were coming forward and saying, "I'm the Zodiac Killer," and they'd be like, "How did you kill your victims?" And the people would say like, "Oh, with a hammer." And it's like the Zodiac Killer never killed anybody with a hammer. They just were trying.
Thing, yeah.
Yeah, they were trying to take fame or they wanted to get the fame, I guess, from that whole entire thing. They wanted to admit that they did it, even though they didn't. But the weird part about the Zodiac Killer, which I think was surprisingly different, was the fact that he left the men alive more than the women. Most of the time in a killer type scenario, it was against women. Because I guess people said the theory was that they were like could defend themselves if it was a man doing that, which I don't think you can even say today. But that was the concept back then, which made it really surprisingly different that the guy usually survived with the Zodiac Killer, which I think might have heightened up their news publicity as well too. Because it wasn't the only serial killing type thing that was happening in the area, and they happened so far apart from each other. Everyone at one point was just saying it was the Zodiac Killer. I just start finding every single narrative out there has to be some creepy, dark thing, which really takes light from a lot of like even the positive ones. Like there's every New Year's tradition. On New Year's Eve, you have like black eyed peas, you have some type of things, and they all have significant meanings, whether it's for money, whether it's for happiness, whether it's for something like that. It's like there's these really common things that get tossed out as like I wouldn't call them rituals. I'd call them like superstitions. But then anything that gets dark enters the realm of like, ritualistic type stuff.
But yeah, those positive traditions, that's part of folklore as well. Anything that is traditional, it gets passed on, word of mouth, also through the internet, past just a couple people, right, and gains a life of its own. And jokes certainly count too, and some jokes are pleasant, some are mean spirited. So all that counts as folklore for sure. And maybe that more disturbing stuff sometimes makes more of an impression for people, right? Because we have certain powerful fears that go with us, but also, as you were mentioning earlier, a need to explain things. So, origin myths are big, right? This thing of Halloween, for instance, coming out of Ireland, you have beliefs about, and it was turnips before the pumpkins, like a jack-o'-lantern figure that was actually somebody believed to be stuck between heaven and hell and sort of floating around the light there. So that little interesting origin stories like that. There's a Native American tale about mosquitoes where a giant, cannibalistic giant is killed, but when they chop them up, I think they burn them, each little piece of ash flies around and becomes a mosquito and continues to want to cannibalize humanity.
Holy crap.
Yeah, it's a neat origin tale. So you get a lot of creativity in these tales as well, for sure.
What do you think the overall message is with these types of tales? Do you think, at least the ones mostly that you've come across, do you think they have like a kind of a key element or something about them? It seems like the ones I always come across happen to have some like secret dark meaning on some type of fear narrative to get stuck inside of your home. You know, if it's the Headless Horseman, if I think I've only come across maybe one positive one, and that was my buddy Paul, who wrote a book on it about Pan, the god Pan, who was like a very minor character in a lot of these great stories, but was a key element. And it kind of was like the sense of the voice of, I guess, nature in a sense. You know, a lot of people kind of dismiss it to where it starts to become a whisper rather than a shouting voice like it probably was at the dawn of man.
It's also an interesting example because associations with Pan have varied as well. Like Arthur Machen has a horror story about the great god Pan, and the word itself, you have that derivation that then ties in with panic, right? That kind of madness. So, and plus, figures of the devil, a lot of correspondence between iconography of Satan and Pan,
Rock and roll, bro. Rock
yeah,
and
sure.
roll.
Yeah, taking those earlier deities and demonizing them. I think it varies though. Every form of folklore has a different sort of function. So you can say there's kind of a policing quality, like you were mentioning earlier, with some of the stories told to scare kids a little bit, keep them in line, kind of boogeyman figures. Some are more exploratory though, sort of more thoughtful about sort of the nature of how things happen, where you'll have bad things happen to good people, and it's not always explained. There's a kind of capricious. To go back to the fairies, sometimes the fairies are a little random about who they give a gift to, who they, give a curse to. It's not always based on being good, and in fact, positive conduct doesn't always earn a character in a folk tale or a war. They're one of the Sinbad tales. You have Sinbad on this island, and he encounters this old man, and you've heard this kind of offer before, like he says, or request, asks Sinbad, like, help him across the little creek here or river. For instance, that's done with the goddess Hera in the Greek myths, and then she does reward. I believe it's Jason. I could be misremembering. But yeah, so Sinbad, once he lets this old man on his back, the guy digs in his hooves and rides him around the island, and takes a long time to get this guy off his back. So sometimes there's this kind of message about more sort of worldly experience not being too trusting. And that sometimes you try to do the right thing and someone's still trying to screw you over. So it varies a lot, the messages. And that's one of the things that's very interesting about folk narratives. There's just not one message, handed down from on high, from a governing body, from a printed book, from a religious authority, but different attitudes and explorations. So I want to take it back to the fairies one more time. So for instance, to riff on the idea of running water, there's some fairy legends and also ghost legends that a fairy or ghost can't pursue you if you cross over the stream. That's a little bit like with the headless horseman, getting across that stream, that bridge. But there's some exceptions to that. I'm thinking of a tale, for instance, where there is a banshee that pursues a man. He not only, but when he first sees her, she's standing in the running stream where he is, basically telling him, "No, that's not going to work. You can't get away from me." And eventually, he dies. So yeah, so it varies, which is interesting because you like to think that there's kind of consistency and coherence and practical tools. We think about, oh, okay, you can always use like a stake to off the vampire and so forth. But often what happens is when you get things in print, certain folk beliefs and versions of tales get cemented by the authority of printing them. But there are a lot of interesting other alternatives out there, which have their value as well, and that's interesting to sort of contemplate.
Yeah, it seemed like a lot of the older ones, that at least the ones I've kind of read across as well too, they kind of have like a message, like a parent to a kid that's trying to like show you how to like, not really like how to be an adult, but kind of like an overall moral message and code that's good to instill in your kids. And then we get down these weird kind of like fantasy kind of rabbit holes where it takes a darker turn, where it seems like someone took the narrative and try to create their own design, whether we get into like the werewolf, whether we get into the idea of Frankenstein, for instance. I mean, the objective idea that society wants to find a way to keep on living even when you're supposed to die. I mean, whether that's immortality from the fountain of youth, whether that's immortality through the digital age, whether that's immortality just through becoming a vampire. But imagine coming back from the dead. I mean, how many people did that resonate with when you've lost a loved one and you wish there was a way to bring them back? I mean, that one's even scarier because then you're talking about a mad scientist and this beast comes back, and next thing you know, it's not the person that you loved. It's a person that is just gone, but it's just some walking body ran by electricity and, wiring and dead corpses rather than an actual physical human spiritual life of omnificence and some type of weird kind of understanding that we're people, you know?
Yeah, and so that last example is with Frankenstein. We'd have to say, okay, well that was a literary creation, right? Because Mary Shelley created the that story. Though it became kind of got a life of its own, became kind of mythic, like a modern myth. In fact, she even calls it the modern Prometheus, which is interesting, like Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, giving this light and understanding, though it becomes a dark thing. Also, it's been suggested this is an example of what happens when a man tries to give life without help from a woman, right? Because you're creating this dead body, this thing that also then hates him, that hates his creator. Kind of metaphor for Satan also being angry at God, or Adam angry at God, or sort of Jobian too. In fact, he reads Paradise Lost in there. But one thing, this is the necromantic aspect is interesting. Recently was reading a collection of Eskimo or related to northern people who have their tales, and one is a couple who are starving, and they're talking about, hey, maybe we should dig up a corpse and eat a corpse. And I believe it's the husband that says, well, there are other things you can do with a corpse rather than eat it. And they in fact bring it back to life, and it serves them and becomes a helper. It gets other complications, but yeah, the idea of bringing something back to life, whether for grief or whether for some practical reason, it's explored both in literary context and the oral tradition. So all this taboo breaking is quite interesting, and folklore often sort of crosses those materials, of breaking taboos, compacts with the devil. Sometimes you can outsmart the devil. Other times, no, you're going to pay the penalty for those interactions. You started off also saying about the role of teaching children morals, and that in itself has been a very interesting sort of development, because you go back to the earliest Grimm tales, and it was actually intended to be shared with adults, collected tales and traditions, in Germany. But then the sort of demands of publishing, commercial aspects, they were sort of pushed to sort of redact and change. There is a great edition out though, if you want to see the earliest sort of version by Jack Zipes, which is the original folk fairy tales of the Grimms, including some notes that they had. So, for instance, in Rapunzel, she remarks to the fairy that's keeping her in the tower, "Oh, why are my clothes getting so tight?" And it's an implication that she's pregnant because the prince has been visiting her. So far above something that a child would be getting, right?
Disney lied. Disney lied hard.
Yeah, right. So there is a lot of that sort of adult material and more sinister and real life practicality and also mystery. But there's also the stuff that was then geared more towards the nursery and young adult education. There have been a lot of authors who have sort of emphasized the importance of giving your kids fairy tales for imagination, and Einstein talks about that importance too. Charles Dickens was concerned about people using fairy stories for agendas. Like there's one that he makes fun of. I believe it was George Cruikshank, who wrote it, about they used a little fairy story to talk about why you shouldn't drink alcohol. It's all about temperance and so forth. Which okay, you get a message out there.
You just reminded me. About to say you just reminded me of a tale I read a long time ago. It was called the Cluricon, which
Oh
was
yeah,
like
right.
so it was like the leprechaun's cousin who used to innkeepers would have to feed him a bunch of alcohol to keep him happy, which would help grow their inn. And if they refused to do so, he would drink all of your liquor. I thought that was pretty interesting, man. Like that's a story in itself where you start getting into this aspect of why are people leaving bowls filled with liquor on the cellar floor, thinking that there's this creature living in there that's going to bring them good luck and fortune if they're able to sustain his
Oh, for
thirst.
sure. Yeah, leaving out offerings. I did get to do a trip once to Scotland and Ireland, and there was somebody running a hotel and talked about how next door there was a belief, and I think the name of the entity they're saying was called like Puddlefoot. It was like a brownie, like a house spirit, um, and that it would sort of rattle the dishes, but it would help clean things up, and said that people really believed it. I had a professor, he's deceased now, I believe it was Hazard Adams. He was talking about how he had asked a woman who was, I believe, a housekeeper where he was staying if she believed in the fairies. And she said, "No, I don't believe in them, but they're there," which is a very interesting statement, right? That they're somehow separate from your belief. While, you know, a lot of psychiatrists and theorists would say, no, all this depends upon your belief. Well, does it? And that remains the question. So folklorists don't have to decide in any kind of X-Files way whether, you know, a haunting's actually taking place, whether there's any objective reality to ghosts or not, or, you know, or the soul for that matter. Just what are the stories people are telling? How do they relate to other stories that have been told? What sort of the features of performance? What do they mean to the people telling them? Those kind of things. There's been kind of a shift from this kind of top-down approach of, you know, somebody just, you know, writing a book and deciding what it means, to trying to get more from, you know, the informants to say, well, what does this mean to you? What's the traditions involved here? How does it relate to you know, your lives? So those kind of things.
A deeper purpose and connectivity, I would say, with the lore.
Yeah, and also people who are actually from the culture writing about their own stories too, to sort of reclaim their traditions more rather than being analyzed in some hierarchical fashion. That's something in anthropology too, like auto and ethnography, telling your own story, and studying your own culture. But yeah, it's very interesting for sure. The whole field and part of, you know, human identity, telling stories, right? I mean, I think a big part of your show, right, is sharing stories and how we talk about ourselves, often telling a story. My brother suggested that, you know, language was sort of the main thing, you know, distinguishing animals and people overall as a development, you know.
I think everybody's got a story to tell, but I think surprisingly, I think a lot of people are just interested in talking, not only talking like not about specifically themselves, but just they want connectivity. I think you start finding that a lot as well too, and that's one piece that's really been missing as the age keeps increasing to a more technological shift. A lot of people just really want to have that connectivity with another person, have this exchange of ideas, whether it's a conversation about whatever, something funny or a conversation about something serious because you feel something from it. And that's the whole point of lore in the first place is when you're able to hear something and feel something about it or any concept in life that has really, I guess, provided meaning. Even music videos nowadays are teaching some type of deep lessons in it. Marshmallow, I think is the artist's name. He's a techno guy who makes beats, but his music videos are all things that can be relatable to young children who grew up being bullied or some type of thing, and it really paints a picture. I mean, musics are going to be folklore eventually one day. I mean, not really the style of music, but just the fact of it telling a story that next, you know, kids are going to be repeating in storytelling for the longest time, where eventually it loses the, I guess, the chains of music videos and brought into more of a perspective of like, this is just a tale that I heard when I was a kid.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, so that improvisation that somebody might have, messing, you know, with a song they like, just to share it and to be part of it, and the connection for sure, and the connection with real human emotion that you're talking about, and that's part of also why sometimes horror narratives are compelling that will deal with something that's darkly impactful because it's a part of human feeling too. And how to express that. And sometimes, although some people will shy away from fantasy, sci-fi, horror because they question the relevance if it's supernatural, especially. There's a lot also to be said what you can actually articulate by using something that's whether it's whether metaphor or just a visual manifestation, something that hasn't maybe been captured another way. I'm forgetting the composer now who made the expression about how some notes are too deep for words. But you could also argue that some of the materials of real life maybe aren't always adequately precise enough to capture some of the things of the mind. And so we have to maybe create some additional tools and images to help articulate what's sort of lurking inside us and needing a voice too. So it's sort of interesting to think about that in some ways, maybe the fantasy building of either storytelling and folklore or, in writing and music, doing something new is helping to put something out there that hasn't really been hit on yet. And there's something to be, I think, said for that, for the connections made. So,
Do you have any advice for maybe anybody looking to dive into folklore, like a good spot of where to start, or maybe a spot of where you found more interesting that maybe some might be interested in?
so depending on what form of folklore people are most interested in, often urban legends are a good place to start because they're current, they're relatable. The Vanishing Hitchhikers, kind of a seminal work that Jan Brunvan wrote. I know there's been some difficulties, I think, with the Snopes.com site because of, if I remember right, maybe some sources not being always or building upon some earlier sources that first broke a story, but they're good for cataloging urban legends, especially that are circulating. That can be sort of a fun thing to check out. I would definitely suggest if someone's interested in fairy tales to get that early version of the Grimm's fairy tales by Jack Zipes to see what that's all about. Also, beyond that, just depending on the culture somebody might be interested in, it would be good, if people get something, I think that's sort of a global, dealing with a whole range of different tales out there. One of the books I've really found impressive and interesting was Richard Dawson's Folk Tales Told Around the World, where you can look at, here's a story in Cameroon, here's one in Indonesia, here's one in the United States, here's one in China, and just get a bigger sense of how folklore sometimes doesn't just belong to one place, but there may be some specific aspects tied to that place, but other core aspects that are circulating elsewhere. So having that understanding, I think, is really interesting to learn about, that, okay, it's not always about the glass slipper with Cinderella, for instance. Alan Dundee's has a Cinderella case book, speaking of that, which could be interesting for people to check out. He's got some other case books where he takes a single fairy tale and looks at different versions around the world. I would definitely recommend that as well. Yeah, and just keeping in mind that there's folklore of every subject. There's stuff dealing specifically with haunted universities, for instance, and specific towns. I actually did an article in St. Augustine, Florida, looking at the stories that were circulating there, sort of comparing what was happening in the women's dormitory in Flagler College versus some of the stories that were being told on ghost tours. And there was some overlap, but some distinctive things too. So exploring is important for sure. And having a sense when you're looking into folklore, when you have maybe a writer who's just sort of grabbing the materials and retelling something versus when you have a book that actually has closer transcriptions of what was shared with the collector. It's a different experience to have that, for sure.
I typically reference Graphic Universe, the comic kind of book type thing. they gave a lot of my knowledge, I would say, when it comes to at least wanting to research more about Greek mythology, the Aztecs, for instance. They have a couple stories about Hades and Persephone, but it's all written in comic format. So you're reading it like a comic, but you're learning as well too. I mean, they had those in my library, in my elementary school. I remember taking it to my teacher, and she's like, "This book should not be in this library. I mean, you guys are like 14, 13 years old." It's like this is a person getting their head sliced right off, and it's drawn graphically. But I mean, nowadays that's like vanilla compared to what most kids are dealing with.
Oh, you remind me of just mentioned the head getting sliced off. Like there's a Grimm tale called The King of the Golden Mountain, where this character who he goes through the usual expected processes of a fairy tale protagonist, eventually getting married, having a kingdom. Excuse me. But he also gets this sword, and he discovers that actually everybody doesn't like him, and he's more or less been betrayed by the family he's married into. So he kills everybody. And he's once again, the king of the Golden Mountain. So some of these are, speaking of serial killers, sometimes these fairy tale heroes are almost like serial killers who kind of clean house. They stand alone with their very narrow values at the end, almost a paranoid worldview. They're also simpletons that sometimes are kind of just like Jar Jar Binks or something, just everything working out for them more or less. So we've been led to sort of believe, right, through early child education, that there's usually this positive moral message, but there's a lot that are often much more open-ended. Some just for comedic effect, some perhaps to inspire the idea that even somebody without a lot of resources can still have a successful life. Things can turn around for them. But others where they just have a hapless case and nothing goes right, and expressing the kind of capriciousness and chaos of life too. So there's a lot of different sort of attitudes that emerge in the storytelling, which is fun to explore. Usually, one thing you can count on, though, if there's a prohibition where somebody tells somebody not to do something in a folktale, someone's going to violate it.
Yeah.
So that's one of those pretty much guarantees. So
That the one of the Grimm, it's the Grimm's tales, right? That's what it is. The original kind of fairy tales from like the Disney movies kind of took off and turned it into a different way. But the Little Mermaid, that ending to that where she jumps into the sea of foam, or no, she jumps into the ocean and turns into a sea of foam, or is it a foam spot or something like that? And the only thing left is like her shoes that float back to the shore or something like that. I'm like, this is horrible. Like she just went
okay.
after the man of her life and left the ocean and everything, and the guy leaves her stranded to the point where she jumps back into the ocean.
You're talking about the Hans Christian Andersen tale, the literary story, right? So that's another thing. Some of these tales we think of as fairy tales were actually written out by individual authors like Hans Christian Andersen. So they're not folklore in the same sense, though the mermaid is a folkloric figure. And speaking of mermaids, they can be pretty rough. Like some of them delight in drowning sailors. They're tales of that.
Sirens, yeah.
Yeah. And just so-called mermaids. I know people have tried to explain, well, maybe they're just like, manatees floating around or something, and sailors just gone crazy. But yeah, they're people that have had literal beliefs about mermaids, and some of them are pretty dark. Definitely. But yeah, literary fairy tales we should think about is a little different than the folk fairy tales. In other words, the folk ones are those that are passed on traditionally. The literary, where an author has maybe used some elements and made their own story. And Little Mermaid is an example of that. Also, Perrault from France, you get a lot of from him as well for the Western side of things. 1001 Nights, another example of that, with a writer drawing from tradition, giving it a frame story, and other things like that with the translation. Beowulf thought to have a series of scribes who maybe did different layers to it over time as well, but has what were storytelling elements passed down traditionally, with the bards singing and these half lines used, and and of course ballads themselves are another type of folklore, that are passed on. Some of them about the spirit world, some of them about love, sometimes about both. So, and also crafts. We shouldn't forget that their crafts are part of folklore, with certain ways of weaving a basket, or some certain techniques used out in the field. anything again that's sort of passed on as a tradition and technique, holidays, celebrations. So yeah.
An evolution of storytelling. And before we close out here, I would like to get you to promote some of your links, your Twitter page, for instance, your website, also your book, Master of Rods and Strings, where maybe someone can get a copy of it.
Okay, yeah. You could probably just go, if you put in my name, jasonmarkharris.com. Would you could see that this book is mentioned there, but it's available through indie places, all the usual big places to online. Vernacular books, you'll see it listed there. There are some interviews online with as well, but my Twitter is at jasonmarkharris1. You remember that right? So
I'm out of the blank one, so I got you. I
yeah.
feel you on that one.
Okay, yeah, but yeah, at Jason Mark. Wait, no, at Jason Mark, HARRI1. I don't. That's right. I didn't complete my full last name. So if you look me up, I think people could find me pretty easily that way. Yeah, and
the book Master of Rods.
Yeah, Master of Rods and Strings. It's funny. It was just referred to recently in this podcast, Staring into the Abyss, where they were talking about readings from the last year, and one of the hosts that was wondering whether it was like a fishing book, because rods and strings. That was kind of funny. But yeah, for sure. Yeah, people who are interested in puppets as well as it's like a travel story too, because you're in France. It's not just about a scary puppet. There's more going on than that. So I hope people. But if you are puppet phobic, fairly duly warned. Right?
I'll make sure I link it all in the description. Jason, I appreciate you for doing the podcast. I'd love to get you back on as well too, when I have a little bit more time. But thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. All links will be in the description, and stay tuned for our next episode.